Yeah, just imagine you're out in the swamp, minding your own business and everything. And all of a sudden, you're out there fishing, minding your own business, and something just attacks your boat. There's about having two fishermen right here. This video about to pull up. So let's go ahead and get into it, shall we?
On a June evening in 1992, a 46-year-old fisherman from Lee County, South Carolina, went to a swamp that locals avoided after sunset. 2 hours later, he was found on the shore, his clothes torn to shreds, his body covered in deep scratches, his gaze vacant. He kept repeating the same thing. Something came out of the water, grabbed the boat, and capsized it. Green, shiny, with long fingers. Doctors confirmed that the injuries were not consistent with those caused by an alligator or other known predator. The next day, 4 footprints were found in the mud near the shore, similar to human feet but with webbing between the toes. Photos of these footprints disappeared from the sheriff's archives a week later. The fisherman sold his house and left the state, refusing to return to the swamp. This is the story of what happened that evening at Scapes O Swamp, a place where the water hides things that shouldn't exist. Raymond Turner had lived in Lee County his entire life. Born in 1946, he grew up in the small town of Bishopville and worked as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. He was unmarried, had no children, and lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. His neighbors described him as a quiet, reserved man, not prone to fabrications or exaggerations. He worked from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening and went fishing on the weekends. He did not abuse alcohol. He drank a couple of beers a month at the local bar. He had no mental disorders and never had any problems with the law. He was an ordinary middle-aged man, living a quiet life in a small southern town. Fishing was his only hobby. He mainly caught perch and catfish in the rivers and swamps of the county. He knew these places thoroughly. Every backwater, every stream, every place where the fish bit best. He owned an old aluminum boat from the 1980s with a small outboard motor. He kept it on the property behind his house and fished alone, preferring the silence. Scapes O Swamp is a marshy area south of Bishopville, about 15 kilometers from the city. The name comes from a distorted Indian word, the exact meaning of which has been lost. Locals simply call this place swamp. The area consists of a system of marshy streams, backwaters, and small lakes surrounded by dense cypress and oak forests. The water is dark, almost black from tannins and organic matter. Visibility underwater is practically zero. The bottom is muddy, with quicksand in places. The depth varies from half a meter to 3 or 4 meters in some pits. The area is sparsely populated. The nearest houses are several kilometers away. The road to the swamp is unpaved and washes out after rain. In 1992, there was no mobile phone service in such remote areas. The nearest telephone was in the city. In the event of an accident, help could only arrive after several hours. Scapes O Swamp had a certain reputation. Locals said that strange things happened there, especially after sunset. There were stories of missing dogs, unusual sounds in the night, and warnings not to stay there after dark. Old-timers recalled instances when people saw something in the water. Vague figures, incomprehensible silhouettes. Most attributed this to superstition and old tales. But the fact remained. Few people fished there in the evening. During the day, the place was visited, but as soon as the sun began to set, everyone left the area. Raymond didn't pay much attention to these stories. He considered them to be fabrications, a way to scare off the curious. He had fished in Swampe dozens of times, at all hours of the day, and had never seen anything unusual. It was a normal swamp with normal fauna. Alligators, snakes, birds, nothing out of the ordinary. On June 14th, 1992, Raymond decided to spend his Sunday fishing. The weather was hot, around 30 degrees Celsius, with high humidity, a typical South Carolina summer. In the morning, he loaded his boat onto a trailer, gathered his gear, and took a supply of water and food. He left home around 9 in the morning. He arrived at his destination around 10. He launched his boat at the usual spot, a small concrete ramp, built in the 1970s. He left his car on the side of the road. He started the motor and headed deep into the swamp. He planned to spend the whole day there. The first few hours passed without incident. The fish were biting well. By lunchtime, he had 5 decent-sized fish in his basket. Raymond had a snack, drank some water, and continued fishing. It was a quiet day, and the sounds of nature, the croaking of frogs, the buzzing of insects, the occasional splashing of fish. Nothing unusual. By 6 in the evening, the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. Raymond decided to move to another spot. He knew a backwater where catfish came out to feed in the evenings. He started the motor and headed there. The spot was deep in the swamp, about 3 kilometers from the ramp, and was rarely visited by other fishermen. The backwater was surrounded by thick vegetation. The water was dark, and the depth was about 2 meters. He arrived at the spot around 7 o'clock. He turned off the motor and cast his bait-laden line to the bottom. The boat drifted slowly. The sun hung low, casting long shadows on the water. It was getting cooler. Raymond sat in the boat, watching the float, waiting for a bite. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, it began to get noticeably darker. The sun had almost set, and the sky was tinged with orange and red. Raymond was getting ready to return. He was about to reel in his line when he got a bite. It was a strong bite. The rod bent under the weight of the fish. He began to reel it in, feeling serious resistance. It felt like a large catfish. The process took several minutes. The fish resisted, diving deeper, but gradually approaching the boat. A dark shadow was already visible under the water when the line suddenly slackened. Raymond began to reel it back in. The hook came back empty, the bait eaten. He began to prepare new bait. At that moment, there was a splash behind the stern of the boat. Turning around, Raymond saw ripples spreading across the water, as if something large had just submerged. His first thought was of an alligator. Nothing unusual for these parts, although alligators usually stay away from boats. Raymond grabbed his oar and held it at the ready. He stared at the water, trying to make out the source of the splash. But the water was too dark, reflecting only the sky and trees. A few seconds of silence. Nothing seemed to be happening. He went back to preparing his tackle, but the feeling of unease remained. Something had changed. It was too quiet. The frogs had stopped croaking. The birds had fallen silent. Even the insects had quieted down. Complete silence, broken only by the slight rustling of the wind in the leaves. His instincts told him to leave. Raymond began to gather his gear, put away his fishing rods, and close the boxes. He reached for the motor to start it. The boat suddenly rocked, sharp, strong, as if the hull had been struck from below. Raymond grabbed the sides to keep his balance. The boat leveled out. His heartbeat quickened. A second blow followed, even stronger. The boat jumped, tilted, and water splashed over the side. A huge shadow swam under the boat, bigger than any alligator. Raymond grabbed an oar and struck the water, trying to scare the creature away. But it didn't help. The boat began to be pulled. Slowly but persistently, as if someone were pulling on the stern, his attempt to start the motor was unsuccessful. Raymond pulled the starter cord many times, but the engine did not respond. Panic grew. The boat continued to be pulled, turning toward the center of the backwater. He gave up on the motor, grabbed the oars, and began rowing toward the shore. But the boat did not move forward. Something was holding it back, despite all his efforts. He rowed with all his might, but the boat remained in place, or even moved backward. Then he saw the creature. A head rose out of the water a few meters from the boat. It was about the size of a human head, but its shape was irregular, elongated, reptilian. Its skin glistened in the twilight, greenish, wet, covered with something like scales or a slimy film. The eyes were large, round, without visible eyelids, glowing a dull yellow. The mouth was slightly open, revealing rows of sharp, irregularly shaped teeth. The creature watched Raymond. It did not move, just stared. Several seconds of silence, broken only by the splashing of water around its head. Then it opened its mouth wider, making a sound. Low, hoarse, reminiscent of a snake's hiss, but much louder and deeper. Raymond swung his oar, trying to strike. At that moment, limbs rose from the water, two long arms covered with the same greenish skin. The fingers were long, bony, and webbed. At the ends were black, sharp, curved claws. The hands grabbed the stern of the boat. Raymond felt the boat tilt backward, the bow rising. He fell backward, hitting the bottom of the boat. The tackle fell on top of him. Water began to pour in through the stern. His attempt to stand up failed. The boat was already capsizing. The creature was pulling it down. Raymond saw his arms bend and his head sink back. The last thing he managed to do was grab a life jacket from the bottom of the boat. The boat capsized. Raymond found himself in the water. Cold, dark water closed over his head. Instinctively holding his breath, he began to flail, striving for the surface. His hands found the overturned boat. Grabbing hold of it, he tried to pull himself up. His head broke the surface. Raymond gasped for air, coughing as water filled his mouth. Holding on to the side of the boat with one hand, he tried to put on the life jacket with the other. He looked around, trying to spot the creature, but the water was so dark that it was impossible to see anything beneath the surface. Something grabbed his leg. It was a strong grip, like iron clamps. It pulled him down. Raymond tried to break free, but the grip did not loosen. He was being pulled underwater. He gasped for air before submerging. Underwater, there was complete darkness. Only sensations. Something pulling him down, deeper and deeper. He kicked his limbs, trying to break free. His lungs began to burn from lack of oxygen. Panic reached its peak. Feeling with his foot for what was holding him, Raymond felt something smooth, hard, alive. He kicked with all his might. Once, twice, 3 times. On the third attempt, the grip loosened. Raymond rushed to the surface. His head emerged. A greedy breath, a cough, a quick assessment of the situation. The overturned boat was about 5 meters away. The shore was 20 meters away. The decision was instantaneous. Swim to the shore, not to the boat. He swam using any style available. The main thing was speed. His arms and legs worked like machines, propelling him forward. He didn't look back, only at the dark line of the shore ahead. He could hear splashes behind him. Something was moving in the water, following him. Raymond sped up, even though his strength was running out. His body was heavy, his wet clothes pulling him down. His shoes were filled with water, but he couldn't stop. 10 meters to the shore. 5, 3. His feet touched the bottom. Standing up, he ran through the water. The water reached his waist, then his knees, then his ankles. Climbing onto the shore, he fell to his hands and knees. He coughed and spat out water. His whole body was shaking from the experience and the cold. Turning around, he looked at the water. There, on the surface of the backwater, concentric circles were visible. Something was floating beneath the surface, but it was not visible. The overturned boat was slowly drifting toward the opposite shore. Raymond got up, backing away from the water. He stumbled over roots and branches. Only now did he feel the pain. Looking down at himself, he saw that his clothes were torn. His shirt was in tatters. His jeans were ripped at the legs. There were deep scratches on his arms and chest, blood mixing with the water. His left leg was also bleeding. There was a long tear in the skin on his thigh, like a claw mark. He didn't remember how he had gotten these injuries. It had probably happened underwater when the creature had pulled him down. The pain was dull and throbbing, but the adrenaline was still partially numbing it. Raymond stood on the shore, trying to get his bearings. The sun was almost down, with about 20 minutes of daylight left. Then it would be completely dark. He was about 3 kilometers from where he had left his car. There was only one way to go, along the edge of the swamp, through the forest, without a boat, without a lantern, in torn clothes, bleeding from multiple wounds. He took one last look at the water. The circles had disappeared. The surface had calmed down. The overturned boat disappeared around the bend of the backwater. The creature was no longer visible. Perhaps it had swum away. Perhaps it was watching from the depths. Raymond turned towards the forest and began to make his way through the thicket. It was difficult to move. His legs buckled. His head spun from shock and blood loss. Every step required effort. Branches scratched his face and hands. Roots tangled under his feet. He stumbled, fell, got up, and continued on. After about 10 minutes, he came to a narrow path used by local fishermen. Raymond knew its location by memory. The path would get him to the ramp faster. He walked along it, picking up speed. The sky was getting darker by the minute. Stars were beginning to appear. There was no moon. It was a new moon. The darkness was thickening rapidly. Behind him, coming from the swamp, he heard a sound. It was the same hoarse, hissing sound the creature had made before it attacked. Raymond froze. He couldn't see anything, only the black silhouettes of trees against the darkening sky. The sound repeated, closer now. Something was moving in the thickets, parallel to the path. He ran. The pain in his injured leg became sharp, but he ignored it. He ran along the path, stumbling, grabbing trees for balance. Behind him he heard the crackling of branches and the rustling of leaves. Something was chasing him through the forest. Raymond didn't look back. He knew that if he fell or stopped, it would be the end. He ran at full speed until he was out of breath. His lungs burned, his heart beat so hard it felt like it was about to burst. But stopping would be deadly. The sounds of pursuit did not stop. Sometimes they got closer. Sometimes they receded, but they never disappeared completely. Something was following him, persistently and purposefully. Raymond couldn't tell how long he had been running. Maybe 15 minutes, maybe half an hour. The darkness became almost complete. Only the vague outlines of the trail were visible. Several times he fell, bruising his knees and palms, but each time he got up and continued running. Suddenly a light appeared ahead through the trees. It was faint and yellow, a street light on a pole by the ramp where his car was parked. He mustered his last reserves of strength for a final sprint. Raymond ran out of the forest into the open space of the parking lot. The 1980s pickup truck was where he had left it. The keys in his jeans pocket were wet but still worked. Raymond ran to the door and grabbed the handle with trembling hands. He opened it, climbed inside, slammed the door shut, and locked the doors. He sat there, breathing heavily, peering into the darkness of the forest through the window. A few seconds of silence. Then a silhouette appeared at the edge of the forest, about 10 meters from the car. Raymond couldn't make out any details, only the general shape. A tall figure, stooped, with disproportionately long arms hanging below the knees. It stood motionless, facing the car. Raymond sat, afraid to move or make a sound. The figure stood there for about 30 seconds, maybe longer. Then it slowly turned and disappeared back into the thicket. The crackling of branches, the rustling of leaves, then silence. Raymond waited another minute. Then, with trembling hands, he inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine started on the first try. He shifted into gear and pressed the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, its wheels spinning on the wet ground, then finding traction. He turned around and drove along the dirt road to the highway without looking back. The speed was excessive for such a road. The car shook on the bumps, but he didn't slow down. Only when he reached the asphalt of the main highway did he calm down a little. He turned on the headlights and headed toward the city. On the way, he realized he needed medical attention. Multiple wounds were bleeding. His clothes were completely soaked, partly with water, partly with blood. His head was spinning. His vision was beginning to blur. He needed medical attention and to contact the police. He had to report the accident. He reached Bishopville around 10 o'clock in the evening. He immediately headed for a small hospital on Main Street. He drove into the parking lot and got out of the car, barely able to stand. He made his way to the entrance and pushed the door open. The nurse on duty, seeing his condition, immediately called for help. A few moments later, Raymond was seated in a wheelchair and taken to the treatment room. The doctor who arrived a few minutes later was a young specialist in his 30s, named Michael Henderson. He cut away the remains of Raymond's clothing and examined his injuries. He counted 17 deep scratches and lacerations on his arms, chest, back, and legs. The most serious injury was on his left thigh, a wound about 15 centimeters long, where the skin and part of the muscle tissue had been cut open. Dr. Henderson asked questions about the cause of the injuries. Raymond, in a state of shock, could only repeat fragmented phrases about an attack in the swamp, about something that came out of the water. The doctor, assuming that the patient was in post-traumatic shock and possibly delirious, focused on medical care. It was necessary to treat the wounds, apply stitches, and administer the necessary medications. The police questions could wait. The treatment process took more than an hour. The doctor stitched the deepest wounds, treated all the wounds with antiseptic solutions, and applied sterile bandages. He administered tetanus serum and broad-spectrum antibiotics. Raymond sat silently, staring into space. He shuddered periodically, as if reacting to invisible stimuli. When the treatment was completed, around midnight, the doctor recommended that the patient stay in the hospital overnight for observation. Raymond did not object. He was placed on a couch in a private room, given water and advised to rest. He lay down, closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Every time he closed his eyes, images appeared. Yellow eyes without eyelids, greenish shiny skin, long fingers with black claws. The nurse called the police in accordance with protocol for injuries of unknown origin. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the officer on duty arrived at the hospital. Deputy Sheriff David Miller, an employee in his 40s with 15 years of experience. He entered the ward, introduced himself, and sat down on a chair next to the couch. Raymond turned his head and stared at the officer for a few seconds. Then he began to talk, slowly, with pauses, but coherently. He recounted the entire sequence of events, going fishing, deciding to stay until evening, the attack. He described the creature in detail, greenish in color, with a large, irregularly shaped head, long arms, and webbed fingers. He told how it had overturned the boat, pulled him underwater, and how he had managed to break free and reach the shore. Miller listened attentively, taking notes in his notebook. His face remained professionally neutral. At the end of the story, the officer asked clarifying questions about the exact location of the incident, the time, the presence of witnesses, and the location of the boat. This was followed by standard questions about alcohol or drug use. Raymond firmly stated that he was completely sober and had not taken any drugs. Miller recorded the testimony, closed his notebook, and said that a search party would be organized in the morning to examine the scene. He suggested that the attack could have been carried out by a large alligator during a period of increased aggression. Raymond insisted that it was not an alligator, that the creature had hands with fingers similar to human ones, but with webbing. The officer reassured him that everything would be checked, recommended that he rest and report any additional memories. After the officer left, Raymond was alone. He spent the rest of the night with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He understood that they did not fully believe him. They assumed psychological shock or misinterpretation of events in the dark, but he knew for sure what he had seen. It was not an ordinary animal. It was something completely different. On the morning of June 15th, a search party was organized from the Lee County Sheriff's Office. It included Deputy Sheriff Miller, 2 additional officers, a gamekeeper from the Department of Natural Resources named Thomas Reed, and a local guide familiar with the swamp. The team was equipped with 2 boats, the necessary gear, and photographic equipment. They arrived at the scene around 9 in the morning. Raymond's overturned boat was found stuck in the coastal thickets on the opposite side of the backwater. The team approached it and conducted an inspection. The aluminum hull was deformed, with deep dents and scratches visible on it. Gamekeeper Reed carefully examined the nature of the damage. His conclusion was clear. These were not alligator marks. Alligators attack with their jaws, leaving bite marks and pressure marks. Here, however, there were marks similar to claw scratches, deep, parallel grooves, as if a large animal had scratched the metal with its limbs. Miller suggested a bear. Reed rejected this version. Bears do not live in these swampy areas. A cougar was also ruled out. These animals avoid water and leave a different type of tracks. The boat was turned over and pulled ashore. Inside, they found Raymond's belongings, fishing tackle, a box of bait, and 1 oar. The second oar was missing. Everything was photographed, and a detailed inspection report was compiled. The group moved to the section of the shore where Raymond was believed to have gotten out of the water. They found corresponding traces, trampled grass, broken branches, bloodstains on the ground, and tree roots. They traced the route through the forest to the trail. Everything matched the testimony. Returning to the shore of the backwater, Gamekeeper Reed conducted a detailed inspection of the muddy shore. He found traces, 4 distinct prints, in soft mud, located about a meter apart. He called the rest of the group. The officers came over to inspect. The tracks were unusual. They resembled human footprints, but were much larger, about 35 centimeters long. 5 toes were visible, with clear webbing between them, similar to that found in waterfowl or amphibians. The heel was wide and the toes were splayed. The depth of the print was about 2 centimeters, indicating the considerable weight of the creature that left the trace. Miller crouched down for a closer look. He took out a tape measure, took measurements, and recorded the results in his notebook. Then he ordered photographs to be taken. Several pictures were taken from different angles, with a ruler placed in the frame to determine the scale. Miller asked the gamekeeper about possible identification. Reed was silent for a long time, studying the prints. His answer was honest. He didn't know. He had never seen such tracks before. They did not correspond to any known species of local fauna. He suggested that it might be a fake, a hoax. Miller rightly objected. Who could have known in advance that the group would come to this particular spot for inspection? Reed could not offer a reasonable explanation. The group spent several more hours at the scene. They examined the banks more thoroughly, inspected the water surface, and looked for additional traces or material evidence. they found nothing significant. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they returned to town. At the sheriff's office, Miller wrote a detailed report. He described the scene of the accident, the nature of the damage to the boat, the medical description of the victim's injuries, and the unusual traces found on the shore. In the concluding section, he wrote that the victim was giving consistent statements with no signs of change, no traces of human attack had been found. The nature of the damage did not correspond to typical alligator injuries. Unidentified traces had been found on the shore, and consultation with wildlife experts was recommended. The report was forwarded to Lee County Sheriff James Wilson,